Well, hi there, folks. I'm Dara Star Tucker, and this is The Breakdown. Thank you all so much for joining me here on KJLH, where we sit down once a week and we talk about the issues that matter. You can find me online on Instagram at Radio Free KJLH. If you are not following the KJLH Instagram page, I would recommend that you do that as soon as possible. They also have an app that you can download where you can listen at any time. You can also find me on my personal Instagram page at Dara Tucker B. And I tend to respond to inbox, DM messages if you want to communicate with me about anything that you heard on the show, provide any sort of feedback. Last week, I asked you all to let me know if you wanted me to do a specific podcast episode on finding authentic news sources and kind of figuring out what some of the most viable news outlets are. And a few of you did reach out to me and let me know that you wanted to hear that in podcast form. So that's coming up really, really soon. So I love communicating with you there. Everywhere else, you can find me at Dara Star Tucker. That's Dara with one R and Star with two. Today, I am bringing you one of my favorite guests of all time. If you are a frequent listener to this show, then you have probably heard the guest that we have on today before. I've had him on at least once before, if not a couple of times. And he has provided just an invaluable commentary around politics, around the election, around the geopolitical situation going on in many, many parts of the world. I'm really constantly impressed with the amount of content that Qasim Rashid has been able to cover. I mean, every time I turn around, he is focused on something else of equal importance to the last thing that he just got through telling you about. And he seems to be just consistently informed about so many geopolitical situations. My head spins half the time just trying to keep up. But Qasim is one of the people that I rely on to keep me plugged in and keep me focused on issues of justice. He is a human rights lawyer and he ran for Congress. The man should have won. I hope you run again, Qasim. And he wears a lot of hats, a political commentator, all sorts of things. But I want to welcome Qasim Rashid to The Breakdown. Thank you so much for joining us today, Qasim.
Always a privilege to spend time with you, Dara.
Can you tell me a little bit about what you are up to right now? Because I never know, and I don't like to assume that I know kind of what your life entails. What's going on with you right now?
When I was growing up, there was a cartoon. It was a sub cartoon of the Animaniacs cartoon. It was the Pinky and the Brain.
Yeah.
It was two mice. One was a genius, the other insane, as the song went. And the insane one, Pinky, would say to Brain, "What are we gonna do tonight?" And the Brain would respond, "Same thing we do every night: try to take over the world." And that's my mantra: world domination. Anything less than that, what are you doing? What's the point?
Right.
And so now, and so my wife will get annoyed because when she'll ask me what's the plan tonight, I'll tell her world domination.
Yeah.
And she goes, "Yeah, but after that, then what do we do?" Then I'll ask the question about maybe get some dinner or something.
Right.
So right now, working on a bunch of different projects. I have really focused a lot of attention towards my writing on human rights issues, legal issues through my Substack. It's just my website, QasimRashid.com. And I'm extraordinarily proud of that work because I launched this thing 6-7 months ago. We already have nearing 100,000 subscribers, thousands of paid subscribers. And it's encouraging to see that people care about this stuff and they want to be engaged in this stuff. I'm also an attorney, so taking on some business litigation cases, but there's a few key civil rights cases that I'm taking on that I can't talk about just yet, but stuff that I'm really excited about. That's where my passion is. And then, given the debacle of this last election and the fact that we were outgunned on messaging, I'm spending some time building a community of influencers to ensure that we have more meaningful representation. And so stay tuned on that. Oh, and then a fun project I'm working on is me and two of my childhood buddies launched a coffee company called Grounds for Peace, where we ethically source coffee and invest 10% into nonprofits and other humanitarian orgs. So if you want coffee and you're sick of Starbucks for all the reasons, then check us out at groundsforpeace.co.
Wow, that's wonderful. Can you tell the folks before we start today's discussion where they can find you online?
Very easy to find. Just my name, Qasim Rashid, Qasim Rashid. There's no U after my name. So if you search with the U, you're not going to find me. Just Qasim. That's my handle across all platforms, whether it's Blue Sky, which is the new thing I'm really enjoying, Threads, Twitter, Facebook, Mastodon, Instagram, you name it, Substack. I'm everywhere. So very easy to find.
Wonderful. Well, I'm not really sure in totality where to start today, Qasim, because I could go a million different directions, and I'm going to try to stop myself from doing that with you because you are so well informed about so many things. But the first thing, really, I want to ask you about is I'm sure, I don't know if you remember this. Okay. We were both at the DNC this summer as a group of creators that had been invited to come and just do our social media reporting. And they had a couple of lounges that were set up for us. And I think we were in the upstairs lounge on the third floor. And we had hung out 1 or 2 days just in the lounge with all the other creators. And we were standing there and watching the hustle and bustle of what was going on. I said, "How are you feeling about things, Qasim?" This was not too long after Kamala had been appointed as the candidate. And we all know what happened, Joe Biden having to step down when he did. There was a lot of good energy there. We were all fired up and working as hard as we could to get out the good word. And I kind of looked at you and said, "How are you feeling about things?" And you just sort of stared off into the distance and said, "I don't know. I don't know about this. I'm just not, I don't have a good feeling about this. I just don't think it's actually gonna go too well." Something to that effect.
Yeah.
And I kind of stared at you and I went, "Oh God, cussing. No." I was like, "No." And I made an intentional effort in that moment. I was like, "Just put it out of your mind," because he seemed kind of sure of himself. But, if I really believed you in that moment, I don't know that I would have had the energy to keep doing the work. And now here we are on the back end of it, and I am reeling. I think I've communicated that to my audience after the
Yeah.
last couple of weeks. I am still reeling. And then I'm watching people like you and Elizabeth Booker Houston. And, I'm sure that you were disappointed at the result, but you have probably stepped into content creation a lot more quickly than I have. I still am not back to doing a whole lot right now. So, can you tell me, at least in that moment, what you were thinking and what you were feeling? This is all the way back in, what is it, July or August? That was
July.
probably
Yeah.
August.
July, August. Yes. Yeah. No, I do remember the conversation. And I remember what I said because you were the third or fourth person who just very candidly asked me that question. And I said, I don't see the path to victory right now.
Yeah.
I just
Yeah.
don't see it. And what we've learned since the election, some really daunting and painful stuff. For example, we learned that the internal metrics for the Biden campaign before he stepped down were a slaughter. They,
Yeah.
they had Donald Trump getting 400 electoral votes,
Hmm.
an absolute slaughter. And that when he was finally forced out and Harris stepped in, it was only nominally better. And the third thing we've learned is that at no point during the 107-day campaign that she was afforded did the internal polling have her winning. And that's significant because internal polling is generally a lot more gracious than independent or third party polling. And even that didn't have her on a path to victory. And, you know, the concerns that led me to say, Dara, I don't see a path to victory, they were realized, they were solidified. I had hoped that they would do things that would ensure victory, things like having a Palestinian speaker at the DNC, listening to what 77% of Democrats and 63% of Americans want, according to polling, of stopping offensive arms from Netanyahu, sticking to the very powerful progressive message of guaranteed universal health care. 72% of Americans want guaranteed universal health care, something like 82% of Democrats do.
Hmm.
What I was fearful of most was that young people were going to get turned off. I knew the American Muslim vote wasn't enough to swing the election. I knew Black women were going to show up. I knew Black men were going to show up. We knew how white people were going to vote as well.
Hmm.
For me, the X factor was, are we sending a message that is going to tell young people that, hey, we're looking out for you? Because young people helped Joe Biden win in 2020. And the moment I knew for sure we were going to lose the election, the moment if you had asked me to bet my house on it, I would have bet my house on it, was when Kamala Harris was on The View and she was asked, what would you do differently than Joe Biden?
Yeah.
And she said she wouldn't do anything differently.
Yeah.
It was game over at that point because all the other factors, not having a primary, not letting people be involved, were severe. But I still saw a semblance of hope that now we've got a dynamic young woman, a Black woman, an Asian woman, a woman who's extraordinarily qualified and has all the credentials you could ever ask for.
Mm-hmm.
And you have the enthusiasm and you have the money. And then for me, that was the X factor. And my thing was, if we wanted to elect an old white guy, we would have stuck with Biden. If we wanted a traditional institutionalist who drones on and on about rules and procedures, we would have stuck with Biden. We didn't want that. We were tired of that. And I think that is why she ultimately lost, because for whatever reason, she didn't distance herself from Joe Biden. I thought that was a catastrophic mistake. I think if she had come out and said, look, Joe Biden ran to save the soul of this country and he got elected, and we've accomplished some phenomenal things. But I think it would be naive of me to say that we were perfect. We weren't. And here are some things that I think we can do better and that I will do better as president that we weren't able to do this term. I think she had come out and said that. She would have given Joe his flowers. She would have expressed humility that we're not perfect. And she would have painted a vision independent of Biden to say, hey, here's what I can bring to the table.
Mm-hmm.
And with that answer, I think that sunk the campaign ultimately. I think that was the final nail in the coffin.
So when I hear that kind of analysis, the first thing I think is, well, what she did do instead of what you are suggesting would have actually solidified things for her, what she ended up doing was pushing her campaign to the center or even center right.
Yeah.
Ended up, of course, we were both at the DNC. And we saw the number of Republican speakers, Adam Kissinger and Liz Cheney, and of course, the endorsement of Dick Cheney and all of these people. She was really reaching out to those disaffected Republicans, the so-called Nikki Haley Republicans. Do you think that she would have lost that contingency had she pushed farther left on these issues that you're mentioning?
Sure, but who cares? Look, the data speaks for itself. Joe Biden won 5% of the Republican vote in 2020. 4% of Democrats voted for Trump in 2020. Kamala Harris won 5% of the Republican vote in 2024. 4% of Democrats voted for Trump in 2024. It's a wash. This magical center is a wash. It's useless. I don't know a single person on the left who said, well, I wasn't sure if I was going to vote for Harris, but she got the Dick Cheney endorsement. I'm game. I want a president who gets endorsed by war criminals. It drives me nuts. And the new polling has come out since then, by the way, that showed that in swing states like Pennsylvania, the Dick Cheney, Liz Cheney endorsement actually decreased the likelihood of independents to vote for Harris. It actually hurt her. And so I've never seen any data ever that said that a Democratic candidate won because they appealed to center-right Republicans. We need to stop this nonsense of trying to be Republican light. It's been a cancer that has plagued the Democratic Party for decades and decades, and it makes absolutely no sense to me whatsoever. FDR won 5 presidential elections because he ran as an unapologetic progressive.
Yeah.
Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, all these amazing living wage, all got passed under him. And he was so popular that they had to add a constitutional amendment to limit their presidency to 2 terms. And we just to validate this point that I'm making, because I want listeners to really understand, I'm not just being bombastic. You had Ronald Reagan come out with the war on drugs and the welfare queen trope, right? These 2 very racist tropes targeting Black people broadly and Black women in particular. And so what does Bill Clinton do when he comes into office? Him and Joe Biden signed the 1994 crime bill, which decimated Black communities. They signed the welfare reform, which was devastating to low-income communities, disproportionately Black and Latino. And they kept on doubling down on that. George Bush starts drone strikes. Obama increases drone strikes significantly. George Bush builds Guantanamo. Obama perpetuates Guantanamo. Doesn't stop it. And then you have, in the 2016 campaign, you've got Hillary, again, moving to the center. You're already working with the DNC to trounce Bernie, and that's an established fact. It's not conspiracy. The DNC admitted it. Deny any kind of meaningful progressive campaign. And then you go to the hardcore center, and people said, not really interested. I'm not denying misogyny wasn't a factor. Second 24, I'm not denying that racism and misogyny weren't a factor. But knowing that those are factors, you got to appeal to your base even more. And so I wrote an article about this. It was actually ended up being my most read article of the year. where when Democrats run unapologetically progressive, we win. And
Hmm.
progressive in this space is guaranteed universal health care, a meaningful climate justice policy, a meaningful economic populism strategy. They win. Look at how much Obama trounced McCain in 2008 and trounced Romney in 2012. He didn't do it by moving to the center. He did it by running as a progressive and by not apologizing for that. The fact that we keep trying to win over people who already have a party, they're already conservatives. We're not going to magically flip them into being progressive in this space. But what we can do is recognize that the younger generation is overwhelmingly left leaning, and we need to reach out to them. This election, there was a 30-point shift to the right. And that happened not necessarily because people flipped. That happened because one, we didn't invest the resources to reach out to them. And two, they stayed home, right? 10 million fewer people voted for Harris than did for Biden. They stayed home because they're like, we already voted for Biden once. He promised he'd be a one-term president. He lied. And now Harris is coming in and saying that I'm going to be the exact same damn thing. It's like, nah, I'm not interested. And I think that's where we need to stop this nonsense of trying to go to the center, because the center has moved right over the last 40 years. And we need to build a true left party that focuses on economic, social, and climate justice with meaningful policy. You know, we can talk about reparations. Nobody even has the courage to utter the word of reparations. It's cowardly. It's pathetic. It's disgusting. And until we can have politicians with the courage to speak up for these basic humanitarian issues that matter, we're not going to win any election. There's no way.
Hmm. Well, you're getting me fired up, Qasim. I'm one of those people.
Sorry.
I've just been feeling utter dejection at this point because what I know that we are going to have to deal with for the next 4 years. And I kind of want to ask you first about a lot of the fatalism that I'm hearing right now. It's very easy to be hyperbolic at a time like this. It's just kind of an unknown. Donald Trump is very unpredictable. He is a chaos agent. We have already had a Donald Trump presidency. We know that he has retooled and he's going to come back more chaotic than ever and prepared to enact an even more clownish vision of what he wants for America than what he even did back in 2016. So we kind of already have a little bit of a model for this, but we really don't quite know how bad it could be, how bad it could be. So that's the first part of what I want to ask you. And then I want to talk about, as Kamala Harris said, the way forward. What is the way forward? So first, what is your assessment of what we should expect over the next 4 years?
However bad you think it's going to be worse.
I agree.
That's the bluntest way I can put it.
I agree.
Because now you've got a very organized right-wing movement funded with unlimited money and with zero checks.
Yeah.
We don't have the Senate.
Yeah.
We don't have the Supreme Court. We don't have the White House. We've got zero checks. So as much as Democrats are talking about, you know, we're going to fight and we're going to, you know, how? How? What are you going to practically do? When you had the House, the White House, and the Senate, you didn't reform the filibuster. You didn't expand the Supreme Court. You didn't raise the living wage. You didn't protect Roe. Sure, you passed some bills that have been meaningful and consequential. Great. But from, you know, you didn't pass voting rights. From a fundamental perspective of these key issues, what did you do? And so now the right is emboldened into thinking they have a mandate, even though they slipped by with a small victory, and there's no checks and balances. So however bad you think it's going to be significantly worse. That's one. Two, as far as the way forward, I am always reminded of the wisdom of James Baldwin in this, because it is easy to despair. And he was asked late in his life by a journalist that, how do you overcome the despair that you're feeling? And he responds that, I don't think I'm in despair. I'm angry, but I'm not in despair. I can't afford to be in despair. I can't afford to tell my nephew, my niece, you can't tell children that there's no hope. So I always have hope. And so when I think of someone like James Baldwin and what he lived through in Jim Crow America, and what, you know, the gem of a human being that he was all along, and the gems of wisdom he's given us, the fact that he holds on to that hope is something that I think about often as well. And I think about the fact that, my children, my nephews and nieces, the young people in my life, I can't go to them and say, there's no hope, give up, forget about it.
Mhm.
But then from a practical standpoint, what does that look like, right? Because rhetoric is one thing. Practically, what does that look like? And I think in almost every faith scripture, there's a teaching that charity begins at home. And that's where I encourage folks to get hyper involved locally. You should know, who are my school board members? Who are my city council persons? Who is on my county board? Who's my alder person, right? All these things, you should know who these people are. And if there's somebody who aligns with their values, get behind them. Invest your time, your money, your resources into them. Make sure they get reelected. Make sure that when they're working and then you want to pass a positive agenda, you're working with them to pass that agenda. And if you can't find anyone who's a decent person, run yourself. But start locally. 90% of politics is local. I assure you, 90% is local. Everything that you deal with on a daily basis, your traffic lights, fixing that pothole, making sure your school has enough resources, making sure there's enough volunteers for an XYZ project, your park district, your forest preserve, there's all local stuff that you're dealing with on a daily basis. Put your nose down, grab 2 or 3 of your friends that you can voluntold and they can't say no to you, and bring them with you, and then just get to work on a local level. And that done effectively on a nationwide scale will bring about meaningful change in the long term. There's no Thanos snap of our fingers here. Can I make Marvel references in this? I don't know if I can, but
Absolutely.
there's no Thanos snap that will fix this. But there is meaningful hope if you stay hyper engaged on the local level, and it'll help you maintain your sanity. It'll help you connect with some really thoughtful people who also care deeply. It'll help create momentum on the statewide and national scale as well.
That's great advice. Can I ask you a very practical bit of advice, and then I want to take you from local to global
Great.
because you're also an expert in that area. If people want to get involved locally, like how do we start that? Because I hear that a lot. Get involved and know who this person is, know who this person is.
Yeah.
When they're looking for those resources, where do they start?
Relationships are the key aspect here, and it's a matter of building those relationships. So look for your local Democratic committee when they're meeting next. You can find them on Facebook. You can Google, whatever town you're in. If you're in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, type in Lancaster Democratic Committee, and there's
Mhm.
going to be a local chair. Email them, say, hi, my name's Qasim. I want to get involved. What can I do? And some of you will find that the local chair is excellent and has their stuff together. And others will find that there's somebody who probably needs to, retire and spend some time with the great grandkids or something like that. And so, there was one person who said that they went to the local committee and there were these older people who the age wasn't the issue, but they were still pretty right-wing Democrats. And so elections were coming up. So this person got 20 of their friends to show up at the election, pay whatever their membership fee was, and they all voted for this person to be the new Democratic chair on the local committee. So young people, that's how you do a coup. That's how you do a coup of a local party. Get 20 of your friends to show up, make sure they paid their membership dues for the year. It's like $25, and then have them all vote for you and make you local president and get to work that way as well. So that's where I would start. I would also, there's plenty of resources online where you can find out who your local elected officials are. Let them know you want to be part of whatever work they're doing, and then just build a relationship.
So, moving on from the very hyper local politics
Yes.
to global politics, about which you are, I would say, really an expert. We were talking a little bit before we started taping, is you're just coming back from Pakistan, which is the country of your parents. Um,
Well, the country of my birth as well.
your birth, okay,
Yeah.
no.
Yep.
But you're coming back from there and are describing a very volatile political situation. And I am attending a conference this week in Washington, D.C., where I am getting to interface with a bunch of German folks, and they're talking to me about what's going on with their president, who's just been given a vote of no confidence. In France, there's a pretty volatile political situation where they are having a special election. The Germans will be holding a special election because they've kicked out their president. South Korea, we know, has been a tinderbox, and the president declared martial law, at least temporarily. And now the defense minister is stepping out. It's crazy. There are a lot of really wild situations going on simultaneously right now. What is going on right now? Let me just ask it that way.
I think there's a global right-wing shift to kind of everything that's happening. Yeah, and it could be for a number of reasons. It could be Russian disinformation on a global scale. We know that they had a significant role in Brexit. We know they had a significant role in Trump's win in 2016, a significant role in his win in 2024. China's becoming much more powerful as well, and their influence is there. But I think fundamentally, what we're seeing is a massive backlash, misplaced, but backlash to the growing wealth and income inequality. The global wealth and income inequality it is unprecedented. It is astronomical. It's never been this bad before. And the last two times it was this bad, it helped engage a global world war. And that's my concern right now. And my deepest concern right now is that happening with nuclear weapons, because that's going to be catastrophic on a scale that we can't even fathom right now. And I hope we don't ever see it, but my fear is that that's the direction in which we're headed. And we see some bright spots. Brazil had a right-wing nut job, and then they elected Luna, who's a staunch progressive, and we're seeing progress there. But I think by and large, whether it's India, China, Russia, the United States, we're seeing a significant surge in right-wing political ideology that is kind of the backlash. And I think a lot of right-leaning candidates are running as populists, and that's what's being an effective means to get their message across. I wish Democrats in the United States had that kind of courage and foresight. We don't, unfortunately, but I think that's what's happening on a global scale.
Hmm. I've been really studying a little bit about really the way that politics began to shift around Reagan's time and the change that he brought about globally. And I don't think we talk enough about that because the major shift before that time really happened, as you mentioned, with Franklin Roosevelt. He essentially created the middle class. And I don't think people think enough, or we don't talk enough about the fact that a middle class had to be created.
That's right.
It doesn't just come about naturally.
That's right.
As a natural outflow of building a society that's free and democratic. And okay, we've got all these folks that can afford to send their children on vacation and can afford shoes and have good jobs and have a livable wage. And, all of that stuff doesn't just come about because we're just good people and we believe in democracy.
Yeah.
Has to be created.
That's right.
And that's a lot of what Franklin Roosevelt brought about. And when Reagan came to the fore, a lot of that philosophy shifted. And there started to be just this targeted attack against the middle class. And my perception is that we are essentially still in the era of Reagan. Is that a correct assessment, that we're seeing the fruits of that laissez-faire capitalism we're now watching those chickens come home to roost, as they say?
Yeah. Look, I've long said the only difference between Donald Trump and Ronald Reagan is that Reagan was a bit more eloquent. But Reagan was a horrible human being.
Yeah.
He was racist. He referred to Africans as monkeys.
Monkey.
He was a homophobe. He mocked the AIDS crisis and laughed at the idea of gay men dying from AIDS. He was a hardcore Islamophobe. He sold weapons illegally to Iran. He printed textbooks in Nebraska to radicalize Afghan youth to fight against the Soviets. He enacted the trickle-down scam, which has since reallocated $50 trillion in wealth from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. Trillion, not billion, trillion in wealth. He was a horrible human being. And we already talked about his war on drugs and the welfare queen trope and all that other, trash that he put out there. But a lot of folks don't realize that he was also the brainchild behind abolishing public college. That was and he did it because he didn't want Black and brown people to attain higher education. And so the man was a white supremacist with a silver tongue.
And people don't know this. Reagan started one of his primary campaign events in Philadelphia, Mississippi, which was the place that those civil rights leaders in Freedom Summer were killed by the Ku Klux Klan. Philadelphia, Mississippi. Why does someone from California launch their campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi? That is sending out a very specific signal to a very specific group of people. Make America Great Again was Reagan.
That's right.
Donald Trump stole that slogan from Reagan.
Right. That's right. And when you think about Reagan's formative years, it was in the early 20th century when the KKK represented 4 million people, right? There were, 4 million people at a time when the country's population was only 100 million. He grew up at a time where white Americans, 1 in 11 white Americans, were a card-carrying member of the KKK. That's when he grew up. And so those are his formative years. And, there's the old saying that hard times create tough people create good times create weak people create hard times.
Mm.
And Reagan and his generation grew up in a period of much better times because of the work done in the post World War II, and that's when he came into power. And the good times that they enjoyed in the 19 economic good times, 50s, 60s, and 70s, as the middle class grew that you just talked about, this was at a time when you had massive change in the United States. You had the transition from Jim Crow America to the Civil Rights Movement. And then you saw the white lash. You saw white folks saying, hold on a second, why are black folks also getting the GI Bill all of a sudden? Hold on a second, why are there brown people from Asia immigrating here before they were banned from 1944? Why are we letting them in here? Well, hold on a 2nd. Who are these Latinos who suddenly think this is their country even though they've been here all along? Who are these women who think that they can have financial autonomy when they need their own permission, right? And there's been study after study after study that shows that white Americans don't actually mind welfare. They don't care. They only mind when black and brown people get access to welfare.
Yeah.
And Jonathan Metzer, a white professor, has written a book called Dying of Whiteness, where he kind of documents this extraordinarily well. And where Reagan enacted back in the 70s and 80s was the hope for white Americans to kind of reclaim their mantle of superiority and authority after they had been punched in the mouth, so to speak, of the Civil Rights Act and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and the Immigration Nationalization Act. And then we saw this period of American growth in the post-Jim Crow era that I think culminated with the election of the first black president. And then you kind of had this white lash that said, hold on a second, now we're getting way too ahead of ourselves. And I think Trump kind of represents that white lash. Now, in an ideal world, Biden would not have run in 2020, and we would have had a dynamic young candidate that would have been happily elected to re-election. But this is the problem, and this is my criticism, and I say this as someone who's run for Congress as a Democrat, who's won the Democratic nomination, that we need to be willing to criticize our own party here, where we know the history of this country as a country that was built on stolen land by people stolen from their land. And we know there's never been a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We know there's never been reparations. We know that even now these books are being banned and whitewashed because of the legacy of white supremacy. And we know that for us to move forward, we need to have new dynamic candidates that actually represent our party, that represent the left, which is a minority majority party. And you're not going to do that by having an 82-year-old guy who's going to be 86 and expect him to lead the party. And so for us to truly move forward from the modern day Reagan, i.e. Trump, it's not going to happen by wishful thinking. It's going to happen by being deliberate, making some tough decisions in the short term, but the right decisions in the long term, and having a leadership that truly reflects the diversity and the beauty of what this party, what this base, what this country, most importantly, actually is.
So what is the likelihood that that will actually happen? Because it's just the MO right now in the weeks following the election to crap on the Democrats right now. That's really a lot of what I hear happening from every side, every angle. Everybody's taking every sort of pot shot when in reality, Kamala Harris lost by 1.6 percentage points. It wasn't as though it was some sort of blowout or repudiation of Democrats in general. She lost an election that she had 107 days to win, frankly. So, what are the chances that the Democrats do step back and sort of do this self reflection and make a more declarative statement about who they are and where they're coming from and find this truly progressive candidate that you're speaking about? What are the chances that any of this actually happens? Or do they run the blandest, whitest, most innocuous, inoffensive white dude that they possibly can?
Well, look, I want to be clear, though. When I'm critical of Democrats, I'm critical of a very specific, the center centrist Democrats. Look, you guys had the campaign in full control in 2016. You went to the center, you got everything you wanted, you had all the money in the world, and you lost to a fascist. In 2020, Biden ran and he picked the most progressive senator in the country to be his VP, right? Statistically, Harris was the most progressive senator in the country. And you ran on the promise of running one term and then handing off the reins. You said, I'm going to be a transitional candidate. And then you lied. And then you said, well, I screwed up, but I'm not going to admit it. So let me throw it on a black woman and tell her to figure it out in 100 days. If, like, to me, what a perfect embodiment of America. Rich white guy screws up and tells a black woman, okay, you figure it out now.
Yeah.
Right? It's insane. The task given to Harris was insane. It was offensive. It was shameful. She didn't even get a say in the matter. And that's truly a disgrace. That's what pisses me off. I can be critical of Harris and say she should have done this differently and that differently. But at the end of the day, every campaign is going to have mistakes. It's a damn shame that they thought so little of Kamala Harris that they gave her 107 days and said, you figure it out. That to me is a disgrace. And I put that blame on Biden exclusively. And so I have an answer to the question of what the chances are of self-reflection. Look, these folks have lost to a fascist 2 out of 3 elections. And we're at a point now where I can see Republicans say, you know what, maybe expanding the court is a good idea. Let's go ahead and add 4 more right-wing Republicans. So it is a super 8-3, or I'm sorry, 11-3 or 10-3 majority. I can see them doing that. I can see them continue to strip down voting rights so that we never have a chance. I mean, do you know, Dara, that since the Shelby versus Holder decision in 2013 and the Voting Rights Act was gutted, do you realize that we went from 200,000 polling locations in this country to less than 90,000? And guess where those polling locations were shut down? In neighborhoods with people that look like you and me, right? So the self-reflection needs to happen. But this is also where I remind folks that arrogant, rich, wealthy, privileged dudes don't know the meaning of the word self-reflection. It's always somebody else's fault. And so this is where I tell young people, people of color, women, marginalized communities, that we need coalition building. We need to collaborate and work together in this space. One of the most sinister and I think offensive themes that has emerged is, well, the Muslims, them Arabs, they got what they wanted. You know, they were critical and this is what they get. I hope they enjoy the camps. I hope they enjoy the genocide. I'm just going to sit here and enjoy my Starbucks while they get the genocide. The reason why it's so offensive, Dara, is because statistically speaking, American Muslims are less than 1% of the electorate. And if you look at every single swing state, we had zero impact on the actual outcome of it. The reason why it's so offensive is that on one hand, we were so insignificant that for us to even ask to speak at the DNC was laughable because you're so insignificant. What do you matter? But simultaneously, we're so significant that we single-handedly cost the election. It's nuts. And the third reason why it's so offensive is that the single largest demographic of American Muslims is what race? Black. African Americans are the largest demographic of American Muslims. So when you say, well, the Muslims got what they wanted, you are completely erasing Black Muslims from the conversation. And by the way, when you look at the data, American Muslims voted for Biden over Trump 65-35. They voted for Harris over Trump 64-32. So the data was still consistent there. We need to remember that the single biggest asset that the right wing has is to get us to fight amongst one another and point the finger and blame one another as various marginalized communities. And the single biggest strength that we have is to say, no, we're not going to take the bait. We're going to channel that energy into standing united against the hate and bigotry that we're seeing from the right. And we're going to do that by promoting and seeking meaningful economic, social, and climate justice. And so I'm less focused on hoping that the party leadership will self-reflect and reform, and more focused on how do I build coalition and community with the young people, with the thoughtful people from various backgrounds who understand the struggle, and just build this ourselves. And I think that if we do that effectively, then we'll see meaningful progress. I'll close with this comment. You look throughout American history, whether it's Fred Hampton, whose assassination anniversary just passed, he was assassinated at 21, whether it's Dr. King at 26 leading the Montgomery bus boycott, whether it's Malcolm X at 29 being the national spokesperson for the nation, or whether it's Claudette Colvin at 15, years before Rosa Parks, refusing to get up for a white man, whether it's Robert Small at 22, single-handedly turning the tide of the Civil War. Young people, and in this case, I've mentioned all Black Americans, have been the catalyst. And that's where I encourage young folks to realize the power that you really have. It's in your DNA. Let's go out and do this.
Well, Qasim, I cannot say that I am not still dealing with some discouragement, just having been a content
No,
creator throughout this political season. I think I'm ready to get back to a lot of the cultural discussions, the racial discussions, conversations around the entertainment that I love, classic film, television. I've told people I'm going to focus on that for a little while and just kind of step away from some of the political content creation, but I'm still paying attention. I'm paying a whole lot of attention. And as I said, I've got a significant personal announcement coming up pretty soon that has to do with that, my continued desire to be involved in shaping the conversation
amazing.
and just learning more, learning as much as I can about how I can help to be a force for good. And you have certainly been an example of that, Kasim. And I really appreciate the measured approach you've taken. I told you right after the election that you were one of the few people, and I think, that conversation around Muslims and some of their stances on this election and their stance against Kamala Harris and a lot of the vitriol and the infighting that caused. I felt like you were actually one of the few voices that I could look to that really did want to hold that administration to account while continuing to advocate for doing the least harmful
That's right.
thing. I just want to send my appreciation to you, I guess, for your
No,
measured
thank you.
stance on that because it is just something we didn't see enough of.
No,
We didn't
thank
see
you,
enough.
Dara. And I mean, look, I want to be clear. There will never be a perfect candidate. And I don't think anybody was asking for a perfect candidate. I think the conversation around that was, I can't go to a Palestinian family who's lost 30 members and say, give them another chance. Like how
Right.
dare you not vote for the person whose administration killed 30? I can't do that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I can't sit there and pass judgment on them. And I can't tell them, don't speak out against
Yeah.
this injustice. Because if you can't speak out, look, somebody offends my wife on the street, I'm going to speak out. I don't care what it's going to cost me. God
Mhm.
forbid somebody kills 30 members of my family, you better believe I'm going to speak out.
Mhm.
And, the end part is important there. I can also recognize that Trump is a fascist and
Yeah.
that he is going to not only perpetuate the genocide, but expand it and probably enact it here locally and domestically as well. And so that's where I tell folks that it's important that we speak with conviction, but also with compassion and recognize that people are fighting their battles. I was speaking with one person who just could not understand how so many American Muslims were upset and knowing full well how much worse Trump would be, we're still criticizing Biden and Harris relentlessly. And I said to this person, I said, what's your number one issue? And they said, well, it's probably abortion access. I'm like, okay, let's say that Biden comes out tomorrow and says, you know what? I am a staunch Catholic and I think abortion is a sin under every circumstance. And I actually support the repealing of Roe. And as president, I'm going to now push for legislation, additional legislation to make it even more difficult. Would you vote for the Democratic ticket at that point? And they couldn't say no fast enough. They're like, I absolutely would not vote. I'm like, okay, there you go. That's your
Mm.
issue. Now, I can't sit here and judge you and say your top issue is not important because I know the data of maternal mortality, of Black maternal mortality, of infant mortality caused by abortion bans. And if that's your conscience that you can't get on board with that, then that's your conscience. And you have to own that. And I have to respect that. I'm like, for Palestinians and for Muslims, this is their issue. And
Mhm.
it's important that we are compassionate to that while doing the work that we can. And look, the voting end result showed that actually wasn't what flipped the election.
Mhm.
The voting end results show that ultimately it was a lack of a strong economic message. It was a lack of a runway for Kamala Harris. I mean, imagine you hear about Black Girl Magic. Like they expected her to meet 300 million people in 100 days and get their vote. Like, that's
Mhm.
absurd. These primaries take 18 months for a reason. And they expected her to do the impossible. And so, my heart goes out to Harris because it was a very unfair deck of cards given to her. And I thought she ran a great campaign overall
Mhm.
with the caveat of a couple of things I think she could have done differently. But nonetheless, if she had the runway she needed, I think she would have won by a mile. And that's where I'm furious about at people like Joe Biden for not giving her the opportunity that she deserved, not giving the American people the candidate that we deserved, one who had the time to build the relationships. And I'll close with this, and I promise I'll stop my rant, to give you flowers too, Dara. I think you're such a blessing in the knowledge that you share so willingly and so beautifully. Like, I'm taking notes of the way you deliver the messages that you give out there in your breakdown. It's so effective. It's so powerful because you share really complex information sometimes, but you do it in a way where I feel like I'm back in sixth grade reading my favorite children's book. You tell such a beautiful story. I don't know how you do it, but if I could put that up in a bottle and inject it into myself so I could learn how to do that, I would do that. Yeah.
I appreciate that, Qasim. Well, I'm asking a lot of questions at this point about just the efficacy of what I do, the necessity of what I do, where I'm putting my focus. I'm asking a lot of really deep questions right now in this place. And I think it's important to ask those questions. I
Yes.
think, I'm not meaning to just sort of wallow in the disappointment of all of this at all. But I'm asking a lot of questions about how effective we can be, how effective I can be, how effective have I been in my messaging, my communication, and exactly how much energy and attention that I want to give a lot of what is coming up, because this is a different battleground than the battleground we have been fighting on since we both started in this commentary space 4 years ago.
Yeah.
I started it in 2020 as a response to the craziness of 2020, the pandemic, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, election denialism, January 6th. What I am doing now was begun in the chaos of that as a way to bring education and context to where we were politically and societally at that time. And so to see it culminate in this has been a huge personal blow. I'll have to say it in that way. And so I'm reassessing a lot of things, and I expect us all to come out on top, and I don't know how. But people like you are a beacon of light for me, Qasim, because you just seem to have this faith that continuing to work, continuing to fight, continuing to get out the messaging is going to move us forward. And there are a lot of us right now. I'm watching other creators who do exactly what we do, who are just absolutely spinning out right now. And so the stance that I've taken right now is just to step back and to be quiet a little bit. Cause I'm just like, if you don't really have something constructive, at least I'm not talking about toxic positivity in the face of what we know we're looking at. But if you can't even be constructive, like, just shut up right now and listen to people like you, like Elizabeth Booker Houston and some others who are actually providing some guidance. And so thank you for your sure footing. I know you don't have any fairy stories to share with us. This is reality that's slapping us in the face right now. But I want to appreciate you for your leadership and the information that you continue to provide at a time where I am led to be quiet right now. So just thank you, Qasim.
That's very kind of, we lean on each other. I think we all have the voices we lean on, and the feeling is mutual. And I know I can lean on you, and that helps because it's not necessary for all of us to be strong all the time.
Yeah.
It's just necessary for us to know that we can lean on each other when we need to.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for your time, Qasim. Can you tell the folks once again where they can find you online?
Thank you again, Dar, for having me. It's always a privilege and pleasure to spend time with you. I'm easy to find online. Just my name, Qasim Rashid, QASIM RASHID, across all platforms. Whatever platform you're on, I'm probably already there and would love to connect with you on there as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being here. I want to thank you all for being here with me on The Breakdown. Remember that you can find me on the KGLH Instagram page at Radio Free KGLH. You can also find me on Instagram at Dara Tucker B. Everywhere else, I'm at Dara Star Tucker. That's Dara with one R and Star with two. We'll be back next week again to ruminate about the issues that matter. And until then, let's learn to shout.